Invasion of our freedom is everyone's concern.
Professor Dr. Matthias Desmet, Professor of Clinical Psychology on the University of Ghent in Belgium. You're quite famous at the moment.
Some people say so.
Yes?
I'm famous in a small group, I think.
Well, I don't know about that.
Corona-critical people.
You're a clinical psychologist, but now from that clinical psychology you've moved to mass psychology?
Yes.
To mass formation?
Yes.
How did you make this shift?
Well, people seem to be able to see that they were really in the grip of absurd theories or absurd beliefs. And in my opinion, this phenomenon could not be explained just at the level of individual psychology. You had to take into account the effect or the impact of the group to which they belong to understand how people could become so blind for things that were blatantly wrong or absurd. And that's how I actually became interested in mass psychology. Started to investigate it, to read about it in the first place.
You were interested before the corona crisis. You were already interested in it.
Yes. I was lecturing already on mass formation before the corona crisis. Suddenly, the entire society was in the grip of a narrative which was based on mathematical models and statistics that, in my opinion, immediately were clearly wrong or utterly absurd in many respects, without people noticing it. And the strange thing was that it took me a few months before I really, in my opinion, could hit the nail and see that what was going on in society was this large-scale process of mass formation.
It's strange that it took you so long.
Yes, it's strange. Yes.
Because in the beginning we were all a bit in the grip of the story.
Yes, indeed. And that's a strange thing with mass formation. Yeah. An entire society is in the grip of it. And some people can, in one way or another, take a little bit of distance and slowly start to see what is happening, what is going on. I immediately had the feeling that there was something wrong with the narrative, with the corona narrative. But it took me a few months before I could really pinpoint and say, like, yes, that's what's happening. It's a process of mass formation.
What was for you the first warning, this is not right?
A few months before the crisis, I already had the feeling that something was about to happen in society.
Oh, really?
Yes. The end of December 2019, I had a feeling that all the negative parameters in society were exponentially increasing and that something was about to happen. I had the feeling that the complex system of society was reaching a tipping point. So I went to the bank, paid back my mortgage.
Really?
And then 2 months later, the corona crisis started. And from the first week, I wrote an opinion paper in which I warned for what was going on. I said that the anxiety, the fear of the virus was more dangerous than the virus itself. I started to investigate the statistics, and I also got a master in statistics after my master in clinical psychology. So I know something about statistics. From the first moment, I had a feeling like, look, these statistics and these mathematical models, they dramatically overrate the dangerousness of the virus. And then, like, by the end of May 2020, in my opinion, this was actually proven beyond doubt. Just because the initial models predicted that by the end of May 2020, 60 or 70,000 people would die in a country such as Sweden if the country didn't go into lockdown. And that didn't happen at all. 6,000 people died. So that was the moment when I fully started to focus on the question, what is going on at the psychological level in society? And that's why when I came up with my little theory on mass formation. Yes.
Okay. We're suffering from a bit of headwind here.
Yes.
I suggest that we go and we look for a nice and calm place.
Wonderful.
Out of the wind. Matthias, the psychology of totalitarianism. This is the English version. You must be very proud because there are people lauding you, like Robert Malone, like Peter McCullough, Robert Kennedy Jr., also Eric Clapton, who really like your work. It's been quite a year for you, hasn't it?
Yes, it was quite a year, yes. It's a strange feeling, a strange experience of seeing how a little theory on mass formation is spread around the world during the last 1 year,
months,
maybe, yes, or 10 months, yes.
Yeah. Earlier on, we were talking about fear, the fear-mongering that happened in the beginning of the corona crisis, where you made the click to say this is like the mass formation happening. Is fear one of the most powerful emotions that can be triggered?
What happened was not so much, I think, that new fear and new anxiety emerged in the crisis, but it was that an already existing anxiety and fear in the population was reorganized and redirected at an object. Or a mass formation usually only emerges in a society or can only be provoked in a society if there is already a high level of fear and anxiety. And then it's easy, once the population is confronted with a lot of anxiety, it's easy to direct all that anxiety in one time at an object. For instance, a virus, but it could also be the Jews, or it could also be like in Nazi Germany in the beginning of the 20th century, or the aristocracy in the Soviet Union, or the witches during the witch hunts, or the Muslims during the Crusades. It doesn't matter. So what happens, I think, is that when a mass formation emerges, all this anxiety that is already present in a population is suddenly directed at one object, and from there on, leaders of masses can easily use that at their own advantage. The first step in the process is usually that many people feel socially isolated. That's usually the first step. We've seen the emergence of a more and more excessive industrialization of the world. And we've seen how more and more technology was used. And the excessive use of technology that more and more at psychological level disconnected people from each other and also from the natural environment. And once people are in this state, a state which is called a socially atomized state, to use the term that the Frankfurter Schule and Hannah Arendt used, once people are in this state, they start to deal with a lack of meaning-making in life, a feeling of purposelessness, and also, and that's very extremely important, a specific kind of anxiety, frustration, and aggression. What we often call a free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression.
Not binded to something you can
exactly
really see.
Exactly. People feel anxious, frustrated and aggressive without knowing what they feel anxious, frustrated and aggressive for. It's that state that makes people vulnerable and sensitive to mass formation. If under these conditions a narrative is distributed through the mass media, indicating an object of anxiety and providing a strategy to deal with this object of anxiety, all this free-floating anxiety connects to the object of anxiety. And there is a huge willingness to participate in the strategy to deal with this object of anxiety. And once this happens, something even more important happens. They have the feeling to
belong.
Yes, to belong and to be connected to each other. They have the feeling that they fight a heroic collective battle with the object of anxiety. And a new kind of social bond emerges because there is a strong bond between every individual separately and the collective. And the longer the mass formation exists, the more it sucks away all the psychological energy from the connections between people and invests it all in the connection between the individuals and the collective. Meaning that in the end, people are radically willing to report every other individual of whom they feel that it is not loyal enough to the state. That's so typical for the end stage of mass formation.
What's the way out of this mass formation?
Well, you know, mass formation is a kind of hypnosis. It's induced by the voice. It's an extremely strong phenomenon. It focuses all the attention on one point, which, just like in hypnosis, makes people unaware of the rest of reality, of everything that is outside their narrow focus of attention. Once you understand that mass formation and hypnosis are identical, the only thing you can do when mass formation emerges is to continue to speak out. History shows us, and that was something that was described by Gustave Le Bon already, that the people who are not in the grip of mass formation typically try to show the people in the mass formation how absurd the narrative is that they believe in, but Le Bon also mentions that these people usually won't succeed in waking up the people in the mass formation, because if other people continue to speak out, they will typically make sure that the mass hypnosis or the mass formation doesn't go so deep that people start to commit cruelties towards everyone who doesn't go along with them. That's the effect a dissonant voice has on the masses. It's the most important effect. And history shows us, like, if the dissonant voice stops to speak out, which happened, for instance, in 1930 in the Soviet Union and in 1935
all the opposition
in Nazi Germany, all the opposition was silenced. And within a period of about 6 months, in both countries, the cruelties started.
I wanted to go after this to Malaga. There we have an icon of disruptiveness and who broke the mold, which is Pablo Picasso. And he would have spoken, I think, loudly against this. I wanted to pick up on what you said about Nazism and communism. There we saw that artists like Picasso, there were a lot of artists who collaborated with the regimes, which is very strange, because you would think that artists would go against this
yes, indeed. Even these intellectuals and these artists that strongly opposed these ideologies that ultimately led to Nazism and to Stalinism changed their mind once the mass formation emerged and the process of totalitarianization started. That's a strange thing. Mirlo describes this in his book, A Rape of the Mind. Once this mass formation emerges, suddenly change their mind, mentally surrender, and suddenly start to become convinced that this new ideology, this totalitarian ideology, is not so bad.
What's the difference? Why do some buy into the narrative so easily and other ones say, no, I don't believe this?
That's the big question. I know people who wrote books about biofascism and techno-totalitarianism before the corona crisis. And suddenly, when all these phenomena actually started to happen, they suddenly changed their mind. And they even smeared the reputation of the people who went against this ideology. So that's a strange thing. But why it happens, why some people go along with the masses and other people refuse to go along and resist, defy the masses, that's a question that has been asked time and time again throughout the last 200 years. And nobody is really capable of giving us a satisfying answer.
We'll ask the ghost of Pablo Picasso when we go to Malaga.
That's a wonderful idea.
Yeah. Picasso was born here and he was known for his rebellious view on the arts. Something I missed the last 2 years in all the arts, I must say. You know, there's the rock and roll, the theater. There were very, very few artists who spoke out against all the measures that were taken during the COVID pandemic. Do you agree?
The reason why art exists in society and the function, the responsibility also that art has in a society, is rather to break through every kind of conformism and create ever new and always changing new symbols and forms in society. And then now, during this crisis, it seemed as if they collectively forgot what the function of art is. And it seems as if they all, in a strange way, I was also baffled by it, in a strange way, chose to conform and to go along with the mainstream dominant narrative.
Picasso, he did something totally different. He wasn't subsidized. He did it all on his own.
Yes.
Is it because nowadays in Europe most of the artists are living from subsidies, be it directly or be it through the cultural scene. Do you think that's why they followed the narrative in the way they did?
No. That might have something to do with it. But if you look at the emergence of totalitarian systems in the first half of the 20th century, then also a lot of artists conformed to the system or went along with the system, bought into the narrative, I think. And I doubt whether they were highly subsidized at that moment. I think there is something else that might be more important. I don't want to say it definitely plays a role, of course. We can make a very fundamental choice and between either going with against the stream or swimming against the tide, or doing the opposite, going along with the largest group in society. And I think that for a long time already, artists were not used anymore to really swim against the tide. To me, it seems that many artists, in one way or another, chose to the mainstream social ideal. And during this crisis, this only became more evident and more visible, I think.
There were two exemptions, which I saw in people who spoke out against the narrative. One is Van Morrison, the singer, and the other one is Eric Clapton. And Eric Clapton even talked about you. Did you ever talk with him?
No. I know he talked about me. I've seen some interviews where he talked about me. He liked my book or my theory on mass formation. He even wrote a note on the cover of my book now. It's strange, it's extremely strange, yes. That the rest chose to shut up and to remain silent, or even actually really went along with the narrative.
Especially because a lot of artists always say, can art save the world? And now they were silent.
They were. Art should be one example of truth speech in society. Yeah. And it wasn't in this crisis. To me, it seemed that they collectively failed to take their responsibility as an artist. Yes. But because we really were dealing with a pensée unique, a groupthink, and exactly at that moment we need art to break through the groupthink, to introduce like a new discourse. And exactly at the moment society needed them, I think. They failed to be there.
Us.
Yes.
They failed us.
They failed us.
I wonder if what Picasso would have done.
That's a good question. Yes, that's a good question, because it became clear to me how hard it is to predict actually who would choose to go along with the groupthink or the opposite, speak out, yes. And of course, Picasso was someone who, his entire life, throughout his life, he constantly, time and time again, chose to create something new. As far as I know, he never chose to buy into the mainstream narrative or the mainstream style in art. So we can only hope that he would have chosen to speak out. But we cannot be sure, I think.
You never can be sure.
You never can be sure, no.
We only can hope. Good old Pablo.
Yeah.
First we go to this teteria, which is a tea house, traditional tea house. This is the biggest tea house in Malaga. They have a lot of different tea.
It's probably something that stems from the old
tradition of the Moorish times.
Yes.
Yeah. This is the Moroccan version, the Moroccan tea. The Arabs were here for about 800 years, so it's still something that they left here. I think this is like a ceremony, as they do it in Africa, in Northern Africa, as they do it also in Japan. Did we lose this kind of ceremonies in our society?
We lost touch with rituals and the importance of rituals, I think. And that's only logical, I believe. If you just consider our dominant view on the world, which is a very materialist, mechanist view, I believe there is no reason whatsoever to believe that rituals could be important, and still we need it.
We have rituals in religion still, but there's no introduction of new rituals.
I believe there is.
Yeah?
I believe there are new rituals, but we do not recognize them as such. Certain corona measures, everybody agreed, or everybody knew somewhere, even the experts acknowledged that in the end they were primarily symbolic measures, and they functioned as a ritual. They functioned as a ritual, I think, because ritualistic behavior is exactly a kind of behavior that is meaningless from a pragmatic point of view. It has no pragmatic purpose, and that demands a sacrifice of the individual. A sacrifice through which the individual shows that its own individual interests are less important than the collective interests. That has always been the function of a ritual.
It makes me think of the wearing of a mask.
The wearing of a mask, for instance, is one example, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, yeah.
And also the closing of the hotels and the restaurants. The Minister of Health in Belgium just reported, just like that it was a symbolic measure, he said. That it wouldn't really stop the spreading of the virus, but that it was a symbolic measure to remind everyone that there was such a thing as a virus, and that we should fight this collective battle with the virus. So I think you can see in several respects that we need behavior, symbolic behavior, that through which we show that we want to sacrifice something of our own egoistic interest for the collective. But the problem is, if a ritual is recognized to be a ritual, we usually will be aware that it should be limited, that we shouldn't go too far in it. If we participate in the rituals without really knowing that we participate in the ritual, then it can be without limit. And that's what we see exactly in every kind of totalitarian system and every kind of mass formation. There is like a kind of ritualistic behavior which is not recognized as such, and which is truly pushed to the limit.
But it's pushed to the limit by the masses itself. People do it voluntarily.
Yes.
They follow each other. They're like lemmings.
Yes.
They're like lemmings throwing themselves off the rocks.
Absolutely. On the one hand, the masses participate voluntarily in the rituals, but on the other hand, also the leaders constantly impose new rituals. I believe in this way, if we can introduce a new view on the world, which reappreciates the function of a ritual.
In another way than we used to know rituals in a religious way.
It depends, I think. I think if you're talking about institutionalized, dogmatic religion, then yes, then the ritual will have a different function. But if you're talking about the seminal, original, religious experience, which was actually also like an experience in which there is like an open-minded contact with something that escapes all rational understanding, and something that touches the intrinsic mystery of the human existence. I believe in that respect, there is nothing wrong with religion. And that even it's very similar, for instance, to the experience that was the basis of science. Someone like Max Planck stressed that in some of his works, that he said literally, I believe that science ultimately arrives where religion once started, in an authentic personal contact with something that escapes rationality and that transcends rationality. It's at this point, I think, when we start to become aware of the fact that all rational understanding, our rational understanding is limited, and that we need a different way to know the world, a way that is not so much, in which we not so much try to push or to impose our rational, the categories of our rational understanding to everything around us. I think it's at that point that we can start to open up and to move on to a different way of knowing the world, a way that is much more based on empathic resonance with the world around us. I think it's at that point that we also will understand that we need something like a ritual, a kind of symbolic behavior, just to, in one way or another, support our existence as a human being. Yes, I'm more used to the Chinese tea tradition, where the tea resembles more something like hot water. You almost don't taste it, but it's very subtle and sublime. And this is a completely different tea tradition, of course, in which it's more like has more to do with strong tastes, completely the opposite of the Chinese tea tradition. But they appreciate it as well, actually. They also like it.
You drink tea at home. You have like a huge collection of it.
Yes, I have a huge collection.
Yeah?
Yes.
Really?
Yes, I have two huge collections in my house. That's a wine collection and a tea collection.
And a tea collection.
Yes, I like them equally well. Yes, I like them both.
Which one do you drink in the morning?
Oh, during the week I always drink tea. I almost never drink wine. Okay. During the weekend, I sometimes drink wine. Accompanied with tea. I often mix the two.
I'll drink to that.
Yes. The tea is very nice, actually.
It's
very nice. Quite strong, with all the sugar and the mint.
Oh.
Yes, it's quite strong.
Yeah, it's a good kick.
Yes.
Let's talk about science, the illusion of objectivity of science, because we think science is like our new god.
I think that many people are very naive in thinking about the relationship between numbers and facts. The measurement scale has an enormous impact on the measurement outcome. And that's something that we see very clearly, for instance, in the corona crisis, where we see that even counting the number of victims claimed by the virus can be done in so many ways. 95% or something of the casualties of the victim in the United States had several other medical conditions. So, will we count them as a victim of the virus or as a victim of one of the other medical conditions? That shows it very clearly, I think, how relative objectivity is in the sciences. And we knew that already much longer, actually. Like in 2005, that was about the time that I started to write a PhD at Ghent University. The so-called replication crisis started, which showed, it's very surprising, in certain academic domains, up to 85% of the academic papers, of the academic studies, is not reproducible. That means, to put it in plain words, that the results cannot be replicated and hence ought to be considered non-objective and of a very limited scientific value. By the way, John Ioannidis wrote a wonderful paper about that, which was titled Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. There was like a tragedy of errors in scientific research. That was the title of another paper in Nature, A Tragedy of Errors. And also that there was much more fraud.
Fraud on purpose or just by sloppiness?
Also on purpose. The researchers often felt pressure to publish a lot, and they knew that if they had more spectacular results, that the chance of their paper being published would increase. So that was one of the reasons, but not the only reason. It was a much more profound epistemological problem, I think. That was the real basis, the root cause of the problems. And I wrote a book about that 7 years ago. The Pursuit of Objectivity in Psychology. I studied the problem in psychology, but it's very widespread in the sciences. Yes.
85% is fraudulent in a way, or false?
Yes, false. Yes, not reproducible.
Yeah,
yes.
Not reproducible. Yes. What can we still believe?
That's a very good question, and it shows that the tradition of enlightenment, as it started about maybe 5 centuries ago, ended up with a serious problem, I think. In our society, we situate authority really in academic research. We believe that the rational analysis, the rational and empirical analysis of the world around us is the highest authority. And it turns out that actually this highest authority is highly questionable, and that in most cases, it's false. So that's a serious problem, of course.
How can we fix this problem of false science?
I think we'll have to accept, in the first place, that certain things can never be measured, can never be rationally understood, can never be entirely objectively studied, and so on. We'll have to accept the limits of science. And then we will have to try to move on to a different view on man and the world, I think, where rationality is not as central as it is in our contemporary view on man and the world. That's one thing, of course. The deeper question is why we stick so much to this rational view on man and the world.
Geert van den Bossche told me, which was very interesting as well, is that we focus so much on academia. He worked for pharmaceutical companies, and he said a lot of work that's been done there never gets published because they don't want to publish it.
Yes. Yes, the problem you are referring to is well known in academia. It's known as the file drawer problem, referring to the fact that if a pharmaceutical company investigates the efficacy of one of its products and the results are negative of the study, they often are not published and they just disappear in the file drawer. And the opposite is also true. If a pharmaceutical company investigates the efficacy of one of its products and the results are positive, then they often will be published not 1 time but 10 times.
Okay.
Yes, of course, which biases the meta studies based on all these publications to a very high extent.
In your book, you also talk about numbers. That numbers are very important. If you attach something to a number, people believe it more than they would if you just tell the story.
Yes, it's a very strange fact, of course. Like when you measure something, when you express something in numbers, they have a very strange psychological effect. If people see numbers, they believe they are under the illusion that they see facts. While, of course, the relationship between numbers and facts is not at all a one-to-one relationship. You can measure the same fact in a lot of ways. And except strictly unidimensional phenomena, for instance, a straight stick can be objectively expressed in numbers. But it's very rare in nature. We were constantly confronted with numbers about the number of victims claimed by the virus, but the number of victims claimed by the measures, by the corona measures, was almost never expressed in numbers. So this is the most elementary consideration that one can make in such a crisis, namely an elementary cost-benefit analysis. What is the cost and what is the benefit of the measures? Was never really presented in the mainstream media, which is very strange, of course.
And not in numbers.
And not in numbers. Sometimes the collateral damage of the measures was mentioned, but it was almost never expressed in numbers. And that's exactly the reason, of course, why the collateral damage did not have the same psychological impact as the damage claimed by the corona victims itself. If you express a phenomenon in numbers, people will believe that they see facts and they will focus their beliefs and the entire narrative they stick to on that part of reality that is expressed in numbers. And if something, for instance, the collateral damage, is not expressed in numbers, it will be as if, or it will have not the same psychological impact. It will be as if it doesn't exist.
Interesting. We'll continue tomorrow. We go from the sea and from Malaga, we go into the mountains.
Ah, wonderful.
Since you started introducing your theory on mass formation, you've been all around the world. Not physically.
No. Yes, it has been quite a year. I think it started with the interview with Rainer Fulmi. I got a lot of invitations afterwards by quite big podcast, and from there on it's spread around the world.
Yeah. How did this affect you personally, and in your work at the university?
I don't think it really changed me personally. It brought a lot of work, of course, and work which I like to do very much and which I enjoy and which is very satisfying. It also helps me to develop my ideas, to make my theory more coherent.
You're one of few people, I must say, if you count all over the world, who is speaking out.
I think we need to do this in society. If people who have a different opinion stop to speak out, then there is this suffocating pensée unique that installs itself in the world, which is never good, but also for myself. It changes me as a person to speak out, I think. If you continue to speak out, even when it is difficult, even when you have to go against the group, against the tide, this has a very specific effect on a human being, I think. You have the ethical duty, I think, to speak out and to articulate the words of which you think that you are sincere and honest. It's already in the Talmud. If you don't speak out the words that emerge in you in a spontaneous and sincere way, you slowly start to lose your soul. And also the opposite holds true, I think. If you do articulate the words that you think are honest words, sincere words, then you slowly start to feel that you exist as a human being. It can bring you in trouble to a certain extent. Like at university, it's not easy for me to speak out at university. I notice that many people don't like it, but at the same time...
Many people, meaning your colleagues?
Most of my colleagues, yes. Most of my colleagues prefer not to be associated with me anymore.
Okay.
There is freedom of speech at university. There really is.
You haven't been pressed into a corner?
No, you feel there is group pressure. You feel there is group pressure, yes. and you feel the group pressure. No one will tell you that you're not allowed to speak out. I think for medical doctors it's much more difficult than, for instance, for professors.
Yeah.
And, of course, most people just, also mentally, just believe in the mainstream narrative. They go along with it.
Yeah, but there's also a group that does believe but doesn't speak out.
Yes, of course.
Doesn't this make you mad that you're standing there alone with a lot of headwind?
So there are more people that who know and who feel, or who have the impression at least, that there is something wrong with the mainstream narrative, also at university, but who won't speak out, indeed, because they prefer to take the easy way and just remain silent. Yes, sometimes it makes me mad a little bit, because you would expect that highly intelligent people would be able to see the mistakes and the flaws and the statistics and so on.
At least have some critical thinking about it.
And most don't. And that's one of the most remarkable things about mass formation, of course, that the higher the level of education, the more vulnerable people are for it.
Another thing is, it's kind of a trait of yours to speak out. Does this run in the family? Is it something that the family Desmet always has done, or is it something you have learned to
Yes,
do?
it runs in the family, yes. Generations, there are these stories about people in our family who spoke out 200, 300 years ago. Well, that was not in line with religious discourse. And they had to move out of the village.
Okay.
Had to live somewhere else.
Oh, they were pushed out of the village.
They were pushed out of the village, yes. That as a child, they probably will have had a huge impact on me.
Okay.
And from when I was small, I always spoke out. Yes, also at school.
Yeah, frankly.
Yes, in a quiet way, I think.
Yeah.
But I always refused to shut up. Yes. And also at university now, in the 15 years that I was working at university before the crisis started, well, I made my PhD on problems with academic research, showing all the mistakes, the flaws, the sloppiness in the research. And many of my colleagues were mad with me already. Okay. Because I showed and I revealed the problems with academic research. Which I think is the duty of everyone who is working at university. And at a certain moment, a few months ago, someone at university, I won't mention her name, but
Oh, it's a her.
It's her, yes. She asked me, but Matthias, she said, we just doubt whether you still identify with the University of Ghent. I answered her, I don't think it's my duty to identify with the University of Ghent. I just think it's my duty to speak out as honest and as sincere as possible as a professor. That's the core of science for me. And I think that's true. Too many people identify with institutions or with the mainstream narrative or something. That's not what you should do as a human being. In the first place, you should try to know or try to have an opinion on what's true or false, and just speak out as honest as possible. That's the only ethical duty we have.
Is there something behind you holding, you know, like with the Romans, and saying you're mortal, you're mortal? Do we need that?
What can give us the strength to face our mortality is exactly this courage to speak in a honest way, even when it is dangerous, or even when people are angry with you for what you say. Just to continue in a quiet way, to tell what you think, being also careful that you don't speak out in such a way that the people who admire you want you to speak out. That's not what you have to do. You just have to care in the first place for the value of your words and not for the people who are listening to you or who are or not for the response of the other people.
I'll take that into consideration. Matthias, one of your big influences was Hannah Arendt. She wrote about the banality of evil. People don't see that they're evil. They think they're doing good.
That's one of the major characteristics of totalitarianism, I think, which also distinguishes it from a classical dictatorship. In a totalitarian state, the totalitarian leaders typically believe that they do their utmost best. They are convinced that they should reshape society in order to build like a new paradise. And they always start from a kind of pseudo-scientific theory to do so. We've seen this in communism, we've seen this in Nazism, and I think we see this again. Everything has to change, everything has to reshape according to a new ideology in order to be able to deal with the problems, real or imagined, that emerge in society.
Away with the old, let's get something new, and you have to listen.
Such a movement sometimes starts from the elite, like in the Soviet Union. There was first a communist elite who started from the ideology of Marx, what Hannah Arendt calls this diabolic pact between the elite and the masses, which allowed them to seize control in society and to build a new kind of state, the communist state, which indeed the banality of evil manifested. Under the Tsars, there were about like, I think 50 or 70, something like that, death penalties a year. And after 10 years in communism, there were over 20,000. And after 20 years, there were over 200,000 death penalties each year, which showed, each year, which showed how all these good intentions from the beginning actually were not realized. Instead of creating a better society, it was much, much, much worse. That's so typical for totalitarianism. One of the strangest characteristics of the phenomenon of mass formation and of the phenomenon of totalitarianism, that both the leaders and the followers, but also the victims of a totalitarian state usually or very willingly go along with a totalitarian project. Eichmann, who indeed tried to convince the Jewish people to cooperate with them. And Hannah Arendt says in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, she says that it was maybe surprising that Eichmann had this idea of trying to convince his victims to cooperate with him. But what was even more astonishing, Hannah Arendt says, that the victims actually collaborated, that they went along. And it were not only the Jews, but only the people, the victims of Stalin and the other victims of Hitler in a remarkable way. They all very obediently and willingly went
like lambs to the slaughterhouse.
Like lambs to the slaughterhouse. And there is also always a certain part of the victims who knows what's going on and who refuses to cooperate and who try to wake up their fellow victims and who usually don't succeed. There are many letters preserved from the Second World War of Jewish people who try to warn their fellow Jewish citizens, like don't go to that train, it will bring you to your funeral. And they typically were reproached that they were conspiracy thinkers even then already.
Oh, okay.
Yes, there was this woman in Berlin who wrote several letters to Jewish people, and time and time again they reproached her that she was much too conspicuous. She stopped to try to convince the other people because she felt that it was just hopeless. They just didn't want to see what was going on.
Is this a result of group pressure?
I guess you're familiar with the Asch experiment, which shows, for instance, what even a small group can have on the mental functioning of individuals.
Yeah.
The Asch experiments are very simple, actually, and also very interesting in this respect. And he asked small groups of 8 people to give him the answer to a simple question. He showed 3 lines on the left part of a board, and then 3 lines with different length, 10 centimeter, 50 centimeter, and 1 meter, for instance. And then he showed a 4th line of 50 centimeters. And he asked the participants, one by one, which one of the first 3 lines is as long as the 4th line. And even a child could see, of course, that it was the middle line of the first 3 lines that was as long as the 4th line. But 7 of the 8 people in the group were collaborators of Asch. Asch asked them first, which line do you think is equally long as the 4th line? And the first 7 people all gave the wrong answer. They all answered that the first line of 10 centimeters was as long as the 2nd line of actually 50 centimeters. So only 25% of the real participants gave the right answer. 75% of them all followed the first 7, went along with the first 7 people and just gave the wrong answer. And upon being asked why they gave the wrong answer, that was also very interesting. Half of them said, like, well, we knew that the answer was wrong, but we didn't dare to go against the rest of the group.
That's peer pressure.
Yes, but a substantial percentage said that upon hearing that, 7 people in a row thought that the first line had the same length as the 4th line. They started to believe that it was actually true. Okay. So that's extremely interesting. And that's part of the explanation of the phenomenon of mass formation. But there is much more in a large-scale phenomenon of mass formation, such as the ones that lead to totalitarianism. There is much more than that. It's not only group pressure.
So it's not about the money, because sometimes they say, some people get rich of it, or some people, they have an advantage.
I think that Hannah Arendt was one of the few people, maybe even the only one who really understood. She said, even the totalitarian leaders do what they do because of the money, even not because of the power, she said. Because in the end, also the leaders are radically willing to self-sacrifice themselves. And then we are talking about the public leaders of the masses. The public leaders of the masses, the people who articulate the narrative that leads to the mass formation in public space. They are convinced that society should be reshaped according to one or another race theory, for instance, as in Germany. Or here, in this case, I think, we are dealing with people who are convinced of a technocratic ideology, even a transhumanist ideology. So the leaders usually fanatically believe in the ideology.
If we look now at Russia, at Putin, do you think this is a typical authoritarian guy? Does he have his people also in this mass hypnosis?
I definitely don't believe that Putin. I hope Freud doesn't to the
Putler.
To the opposite. Putin, in my opinion, is an authoritarian leader. And maybe even a dictator. You could. It depends, I think. But he's not a totalitarian leader because be it only for this reason that he doesn't start from this pseudoscientific ideology which he believes should be imposed to society, should reshape society. That's not typical of Putin. And I also don't think that his strategy relies in the first place on indoctrination and propaganda.
In this documentary series, Headwind, we are the counter-mass formation. We think we're critical thinkers. We think that of ourselves. That's an arrogance too.
We are constantly at the risk of mass formation, and sometimes we probably fall prey to that to a certain extent. And it's what we have to make sure is that we always can escape, that we can take a little bit of a critical distance of our own position and remain capable to be critical both towards the narrative, the mainstream narrative, and towards our own narrative.
Yeah.
That's the challenge we...
Keep the bird's view.
Yes, indeed.
Hannah Arendt said in her book that the new form of totalitarianism would be totally different from the ones we knew before.
In 1951, she mentioned already that we've witnessed the fall of Nazism, we would soon witness the fall of Stalinism, she expected. But she said, we might see that a new kind of totalitarianism emerges. And this totalitarianism, she said, will not be a fascist totalitarianism or a communist totalitarianism led by gang members such as Stalin or Hitler, but it might be a technocratic totalitarianism, she said. She didn't use the word technocratic at that stage. She just said it might be a totalitarianism which is led by dull bureaucrats and technocrats,
yeah.
which is exactly what we understand now under technocratic totalitarianism.
Yeah. George Orwell as well, in his book 1984.
I believe that the essence of a technocratic totalitarianism is that it believes that the problems of society can only be dealt with extreme technological control of society. The most purest example of a technocratic ideology is, of course, the transhumanist ideology, which believes that the human being can merge with all kinds of technological devices and become godlike, actually. If you read the books of Harari, Yuval Harari, which is, I think, the most successful author at the moment in non-fiction books. He describes this kind of future in which the human being merges with all kinds of technological devices and becomes omnipotent in many respects, becomes godlike. That's why the title of his book, of course, Homo Deus. If you look at the causal chain, which leads to totalitarianism, then you see that the first step always is this mechanist thinking. Yeah. It's this belief that the entire universe can be understood, in mechanistic terms, can be completely rationally understood. Yeah. That rational understanding should be the cornerstone of human society and human existence. It's this kind of thinking that in itself already isolates the human being from its environment, because if you think like that, if you believe that everything around you can be reduced to the categories of your own logical thinking, then you are not able anymore to open up for the mystery of the things behind you, for the uniqueness, for the singularity of the things around you, because on the beforehand, you expect already that you will be able to understand them in your own way of thinking. That's the first important thing. And then in a second step, of course, it was this kind of mechanistic thinking that led to an excessive industrialization of the world and an excessive use of technology.
And what we see now,
what we see now. And then in my book, I describe how it is exactly this use of technology and this excessive industrialization of the world, which leads to people who feel disconnected from their natural and their social environment. The root cause of the problem of totalitarianism is always the mechanistic thinking. So, what we should overcome
is this
mechanistic thinking.
A lot of scientists and big scientists already said this.
All seminal scientists, all great scientists, or almost all, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Bohr, Max Planck, Lorenz, Mandelbrot, Janos Bolyai, and so on, René Thom, they all started from this mechanist view on man and the world, from this rationalist view on man and the world. But in the end, they all left it behind.
They evolved.
They evolved because they noticed, and that might sound paradoxical, but it isn't, that they showed in a strictly rational way that reality, in the end, for instance, all complex dynamical systems, which is almost every phenomenon in nature, in the end behaves strictly irrational.
Chaos.
It's chaos.
There's beauty in the chaos.
There's beauty in the chaos, and the nice thing is that chaos theory, systems theory has described this in a wonderful way. It's this resonating kind of knowledge that can make you feel the eternal principles which can never really be logically grasped, that exist in this seemingly chaotic world that cannot be grasped, that never can be entered in a rational way. In my own life, personally, I've experienced this in a very concrete way. It took me until I was 35 years old before I suddenly realized that the world is not rational. But the more you try to grasp the essence of certain phenomena, in the same way as the seminal scientists did, the more you see that the core and the essence of life can never behave irrationally. If you think in a logical way, you connect the one logical idea to the other. And in this way, it is as if you build a wall around you, a wall of logical understanding, which isolates you from the world. Yeah. And as soon as you understand that this logical wall will never be sufficient,
the bricks will come down.
The bricks will come down. And as soon as you can allow yourself, allow your logical thinking to open up, it's almost literally as if the strings inside of you start to resonate with the eternal music of life around you. And it's this resonating knowledge that is the true knowledge, and that also allows you to overcome, I think, what might be the major disease of our current contemporary culture is the fear of death. Is the fear of death. Because as soon as you tremble together, as soon as you vibrate in the eternal music of life, you know that death is not the end of everything. You know that you're part of something eternal.
We went from physics to metaphysics. I think this is a good time to go from grapes to wine.
Yes.
Let's visit the vineyard.
As the Romans said, in vino veritas, the truth is in the wine.
That's true.
Yes.
We're here in this typical Andalusian vineyard. It looks different than a French or an Italian because we're here at about 1,100 meters high. It gets really, really hot in summer. The leaves have to cover the grapes.
The other way around. They want to create shade and...
They need shade, and you can see they're still little now. See, little.
Oh, they are here, yes.
There they
There's
are.
the little grapes, yes.
There they are. Why are we here? Because you're a wine lover.
Yes, I am.
You are.
For me, the most fascinating thing about wine, something that is extremely sensitive for all kinds of psychological factors.
Yeah.
For instance, if you learn to taste wine, then you know that every time you learn a new term to describe the taste of wine, the flavor of wine, the scent of wine, then you start to taste it differently, the wine. It's very curious. You need, in one way or another, a symbolic framework in order to be able to taste and smell wine. Or in any case, the taste and the smell of the wine will change every time you learn. Yes, definitely. It's an experience that almost everybody has who learns to taste wine.
So language really influences the way you taste.
Language influences perception. And that's so important, I think, also in general in life. We are not aware of that usually. We don't know that the narratives we believe in will create our reality. And also in the crisis we are going through now, we have to realize that the narratives we believe in will create our perception, will create how we perceive the world, how we see the world. The facts confirm our narrative, but it's also the other way around. Our narrative creates the facts. It determines, to a certain extent, not entirely, of course, but what we perceive and how we perceive the world. So that's something very important, I think. And also from another perspective, I really love wine, and it also has to do with psychology. Wine is a very complex phenomenon. It changes while it gets older and so on. So wine is a perfect metaphor for human experience and for human personality types. I have the feeling that every personality type matches a certain type of wine. There are certain wines are very good when they are young, but they become sour when they get older. Other wines become softer and more elegant while they get older. Other wines lose their energy. Every wine, in one way or another, is a perfect metaphor for a certain personality type. And every personality, every human being, every subject will find a wine that really matches himself, that suits himself, that has the same characteristics in a certain way. I think that's one of the reasons why wine always fascinated mankind so much. Yeah.
And you can keep it before they knew here how to stop the fermentation of the wine. Because with the heat, when they made the wine, it became really easily vinegar. Because they couldn't stop the fermentation.
Can imagine, yes.
So the first wines who came from Malaga were very popular. At the Russian court, for instance, they imported Malaga wines because here they cut it with brandy.
Oh, yes. And he created a kind of port wine.
Well, it's a fortified wine, just to stop, because if you go above, I think it's 16 degrees alcohol. 15
degrees alcohol, and the fermentation stops, yes.
That's it. So the first wines who were made here were like fortified wines, and they could keep forever.
Yeah.
They could
keep
forever.
yes, wonderful.
And that's why the Malaga wine was exported all over the world. Matthias, we're here in a stunning, beautifully nature. Do you love nature? Is it necessary for you to be in nature?
It's very important for me. It makes me aware of the fact that I belong to an overarching system, and maybe system is not the right word. Maybe it's better to speak about an organism, or in any case, something alive. You're part of something that is bigger than us. And as a human being, we are not meant to live in a disconnected way.
And nature is humbling, isn't it?
Nature is humbling, yes. It can make you feel small, or at least it can make you feel aware of the right proportions in life. Yes.
Let's recapitulate on mass formation. What is mass formation?
Mass formation is a very specific kind of group formation, which has very specific effects at the level of individual mental functioning. For instance, when someone is in the grip of a process of mass formation, of this specific group formation, then he or she becomes radically blind for everything that goes against the beliefs of the group. So, and the second very important characteristic of mass formation is that it makes people willing to radically sacrifice everything that used to be important for them before the mass formation. It is as if people are no longer aware of their own individual egoistic interests. And then a third, also very important characteristic, is that people who are in the grip of mass formation typically become radically intolerant for dissonant voices. And this can go quite far. In the end...
Sounds familiar.
Yes, and in the end they will typically stigmatize everyone who doesn't go along with them, and ultimately commit cruelties to everyone who is not in the mass, and they do so as if it is an ethical duty to do so. It's very characteristic for mass formation. This kind of group formation only occurs under very specific conditions. And for instance, just before the corona crisis, this was definitely the case. Over 30% of the population worldwide reported not to have one single close contact. And then once people feel disconnected, they will typically start to be confronted with experiences of lack of meaning making. It will be as if their life is without purpose. 60% of the people worldwide reported that they considered their job to be completely meaningless. So
the bullshit jobs.
The so-called bullshit jobs, yes. Yes. And once people feel socially disconnected and are confronted with experiences of a lack of meaning making, something specific happens at the affective level, they will typically experience so-called free-floating anxiety, frustration and aggression. Meaning a kind of anxiety, frustration and aggression in which someone doesn't know what he feels anxious, frustrated and aggressive for, which is a very aversive mental state. Because if you feel anxious, you don't know why you feel anxious.
If you're attacked by a lion, you know why you're, you're afraid.
Yes, and you can consider strategies to run away from the lion. But if you don't know what you're anxious for, then you feel completely out of control. Then all this freely floating anxiety might suddenly connect to the object of anxiety in the narrative, and there might be a huge willingness to participate in a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, no matter how absurd this narrative might be. And in the next step, something even more important happens. A new kind of social bond emerges, because many people participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. At the same time, there is like a collective, heroic battle with the object of anxiety, and people feel connected again. And it's exactly that was the root cause of the mass formation, was exactly the state of disconnectedness. For instance, during the corona crisis, they were all talking about solidarity, but at the same time they accepted that if their neighbor got an accident on the street, they were no longer allowed to help him, unless they had, by accident, surgical gloves and a surgical mask at their disposal, which means never. If their parents were dying, they were not allowed to visit them. People accepted that. Totalitarian states, which were always based on mass formation, in the end always end up in a radically paranoid atmosphere in which individuals are willing to report each other, even the people that they used to love a lot before the mass formation, to the government.
Yeah.
A woman of Iran I was talking with a few months ago, she lived in Iran during the revolution in 1979, and she told me that she had seen with her own eyes how a mother reported her son to the state because she thought he was not loyal enough to the state.
Wow.
And how she hung the rope around his neck just before
Literally.
he was hung. Literally hung the rope around his neck before he was hung. And how she claimed to be a heroine for doing so.
Scary.
Yeah.
To get this message over, you need a lot of propaganda, no?
Mass formation can emerge in a spontaneous way, but it usually will not continue to exist without the constant repetition of the narrative through something like the mass media. Actually, in this way, they constantly re-hypnotize the people a little bit. Yeah. Mass media are a necessary ingredient or component for large-scale and long-term mass formation to exist.
So at the end of the 15th century, the Catholic kings had their reconquista. They came here and they ousted the Moorish people. They wanted to win the hearts and the souls of the people who lived there for about 800 years. To thank the city of Alhama and to show their appreciation, they built the first hospital here in Andalusia for the people of Alhama. There was this woman called Elena de Cesspit. She was a daughter of a slave and a native from here. And she wanted to become a surgeon. But at that time, you couldn't become a surgeon as a woman. So she dressed up like a man. She was the first transsexual, actually, to be mentioned in a book because Cervantes, the Spanish writer, came here, visited Alhama de Granada because he was a tax collector at that time, and heard this story and wrote a book about it, about her. And so she's the first really transsexual woman who was mentioned in a book. She was also ousted out of this town. There was like an inquisition and stuff like that. And you see that also in these times it was very hard to be different and to have a different opinion or a different sexuality.
In some respects, it didn't change that much until now. But the consequences are maybe less severe at this moment. But
yeah,
still,
well, they didn't kill her. They didn't kill her. No.
But people are still finding it difficult to tolerate other voices and other. Yeah. To be tolerant to dissonant voices, even now. It's something typical for a human being.
Yeah, what surprises me, and this brings me to the woke movement, which we are living in these days, is that, because I called her Elena, but that's her dead name, they would say now.
Yes.
They would say now that's her dead name.
That's her dead name.
Because her new name, under which she was known here, was Eleno, which is just, the male version of Elena at that time. But you see that the pendulum goes always the other way, and we see that with woke, that it goes far out, and hopefully it will swing back.
Indeed. Yes, let's hope so. Yes.
So the tolerance of intolerance can also be intolerant.
Of course, it is. I think it is. Yes, the woke movement is a very nice example. Somewhere it started from, well, also from good intentions, I think.
Yeah.
But in the end, it becomes something that makes public space a difficult and a dangerous space to speak out for everyone who even only a little bit deviates from the group norm.
Yeah. And it becomes absurd.
It becomes absurd. It becomes radically absurd.
But there's also good news. Every revolution will eat its own children.
Every mass becomes a monster that devours its own children, Hannah Arendt said.
Let's take a walk to the gorge. That reminds me of Ronda. We'll have a look at it.
Wonderful.
Matthias, we're here in front of a small cave dedicated to the Señora de los Ángeles. The Moorish were ousted here at about 1498 out of Alhama. And what does a new religion needs? A new religion needs a good story. And a good story is a miracle. And so there was this, the story is there was a knight on a horse. He fell down on his horse. There's still a hoof print in a rock there, they say. But he survived. Miraculously, he survived. And he built this little chapel as a Hail Mary. Really. Stories are important not only for religion, but for society in its whole. Are we losing the big stories? Are we losing that in modern society after Enlightenment?
The big stories or the grand narratives disappeared. Maybe the only grand narrative that is remaining now is the grand narrative of the materialist view on man and the world. The grand narrative which says that everything started with the Big Bang and all the rest was a kind of a mechanistic consequence of that Big Bang. This grand narrative that believes that everything can be reduced to material processes. Even the feelings and thoughts in our head, human consciousness, within that grand narrative.
The ghost in the machine?
The ghost in the machine would just be an effect of the biochemical processes in our brain. That's what we seem to believe. The strange thing is that we believe that this idea is a scientific idea, but at the same time we see that science itself shows that this kind of thinking is very limited. It shows that the material particles itself are to a large extent a consequence of our consciousness, the other way around. That's what someone like Heisenberg concluded. He said, science finally concluded that Plato was right. Plato, who believed that the material world in itself is a kind of consciousness in itself, that all material particles are thought forms, he said. So we see that in that way, this entire materialist striving to reduce human consciousness to material processes actually can never be really successful. We believe that rational understanding is the most important thing in life, and that our society and all human relationships, human living together, should be based on rational understanding. I don't believe that's true. I don't believe that's true. I believe that in the end, what science made clear is that rational understanding is extremely limited, and that we can only explain a very limited part of reality in a rational way, and that for the rest we have to move on and try to know the world in a different way.
To feel it more. Right?
To feel it more. Different scientists have articulated that in a different way. Someone as Niels Bohr said that in the end, poetic language has much more grip on reality and is much more important to understand reality or to talk about reality than logical language. It's hard to put in words. We have to feel it to a certain extent. That's exactly it.
Yeah, that's it. Are we reaching the limits of speech?
This kind of knowledge, that you could compare it to what the ancient Greeks called the techne, with which they referred to a certain technical knowledge that is more than just rational knowledge. For instance, if someone learns a certain craft, then first there is this stage in which he can learn the craft just by rational understanding. Someone can explain him, like you can do this in that way and this in that way. You have to go through these steps, to these protocols. When you start to feel what you have to do.
Creativity.
Yes, the creativity, and then there is this connection, this more intuitive connection with the objects that you're making, for instance, or with the performance of the art. It's at that moment that you reach a higher level of knowing, a higher level of understanding, which is much more a resonating knowledge. In Japan, there is this famous quote which says, first you have to protect the rules of an art, and then you have to destroy them. And it's at that moment that you become an artist.
Breaking the mold. We're back at Picasso here.
We're back at Picasso, definitely.
There's another thing that's very important, the fear of dying. in this materialistic world has grown.
It has grown, definitely. In our culture, we can no longer tolerate the idea of dying. It is as if dying doesn't have a place anymore in our way of looking at the world. As soon as you become aware that your logical understanding will never be sufficient, all these ideas can loosen up a little bit. There becomes a certain distance between the ideas, and you start to be capable, I think, to resonate, just like a string, almost literally. That's what I explain in my book on the Psychology of Totalitarianism, that the human body, in a certain way, truly is a string instrument.
Vibrates.
It vibrates. You have the muscles that are over the skeleton, and they can vibrate. When you enclose yourself in logical constructions, you stop vibrating and resonating with the music of life around you. All these things go hand in hand, I think. I think that it is at the moment that you can transcend logical thinking, that you start to be aware of the fact that there is much more than rational understanding. I think it's exactly at this moment that you start to resonate with the world around you, and it is at this moment that you start to feel something of the eternity of life around you. I always say the eternal music of life around you. And that's exactly what you need, I think, to just be able to tolerate the idea that once you will die, because you feel that you still participate in something eternal. Science is a wonderful thing, and we went through a wonderful process throughout the last few hundred years. But we also have to transcend it. We also have to go further. We have to realize that there is something beyond rational understanding. And that's exactly the fact that we sooner or later will die. And that's exactly also the moment at which we will be capable to really live this life. Because if you're too scared of death, you cannot live your life, fully live your life.
Are you a religious man? And I don't mean that you believe in God, but in the literal way of relire, to connect these people, to connect with nature.
I definitely don't expect too much of dogmatic religion and institutionalized religion, but I believe that the original, the seminal religious experience was a very fruitful experience. It was very necessary for culture. And as you just remark in an etymological sense, it means something like to connect with things around us. Yes, of course. In that way, I am a religious man, and I believe that religious experience is the core of our existence. In that respect, not in a dogmatic or institutionalized respect. In the end, science arrives where religion once started, in a connection with that what transcends all logical understanding. And you also refer to the concept of God there, but it's not really a belief in God. It's just feeling in touch. It's just right to say with that what transcends all rational understanding, all logical understanding.
Amen to that, Matthias Desmet. Thank you very much for coming to Andalusia, to Spain, and for bringing your wisdom.
And thank you for inviting me. It was great to talk.
Some consequences gather. They gather around the fire. They came this way from far today to question and inquire. Evil spreads, somebody said, round here and over there. We could react to this attack if only we would dare to love, dare to understand, dare to care, dare to love a man, dare to love.